I was an angry child. I want to say this at the beginning, before anything else, because it is the whole reason this story happened the way it did. And because I have spent enough years being ashamed of it, that I have learned the only useful response to that shame is to say the thing plainly and let it be what it is. I was angry from the time I was 7 until I was about 14, and the anger was not occasional or mild, or the kind of thing that gets described as spirited or passionate by adults, who are trying to reframe it as a quality rather than a problem. It was consuming. It came out of me the way water comes out of a broken pipe, without warning, under pressure, and with no interest in whether the timing was convenient. I want to tell you what the 7 years of it looked like from the inside, because I think most people who have not been the angry child have an inaccurate picture of what it is. From the outside it looks like a choice. Like a child who has decided to behave this way, and could decide differently, if they only wanted to. From the inside it looks like the opposite. It looks like the contents of a container that is too full for its size, and the contents are not anger. The anger is just what comes out when the container overflows. The contents are something else entirely, something that has no name yet, and that fills the container steadily from below, without the child being able to see what is filling it. I could not see what was filling it for 7 years. I could only feel the overflow, and the overflow frightened me, as much as it frightened the people around me, because I did not want to be the child who threw things and slammed doors and said words I could not take back. I wanted to be a different kind of child. I just did not know how, because the how requires understanding the source, and the source was invisible to me until I was 15 years old, and a school counselor asked the right question. I threw things. I said things I could not take back. I left rooms by slamming doors so hard the frames cracked, and my mother had to have them repaired twice. I was, by any reasonable assessment of the evidence, a child who was very difficult to be around. And the adults in my life responded to this with a range of approaches that included therapy and medication and consistent consequences, and the removal of privileges and an abundance of patient love that I was not, at the time, able to receive. None of it fixed the anger. The anger fixed itself, eventually, over 2 years of it slowly running out of what was feeding it, which was grief. My father had died when I was 6, 1 year before the anger started. I did not connect these two facts until I was 15 years old, and a school counselor asked me when the anger had started, and I said 7, and she said, "What happened when you were 7?" And I said nothing, and then I said, "Oh." The grief had been there the whole time. The anger was its voice. I had not known this because nobody had told me, and nobody had told me because nobody had asked the right question. I have spent the years since learning to ask the right question. It is the whole of what I do that is worth anything. If you have ever been the angry child and grown into the adult who finally understands what the anger was saying, this channel is for you. Subscribe right now, because every story here is for the people whose hardest years turned out to contain the most important information, and who found that the information was exactly what someone else needed. My name is Curtis Webb. I am 44 years old. I am a licensed master plumber in Portland, Oregon. I run a 2-person operation called Webb Plumbing that I have been building for 12 years. And in those 12 years I have worked in enough houses to understand that the pipes in a house tell you something true about the house. And that a house with water problems is almost always a house with other problems that the water problems are expressing on behalf of. This is not a mystical observation. It is a practical one. A house that has been under stress tends to defer maintenance, and deferred maintenance in a plumbing system produces the kind of slow accumulating problems that eventually become urgent in ways that are expensive and disruptive and preventable. I notice these things. I notice them because my father taught me to look at what a system is actually doing rather than what it appears to be doing on the surface, which was his approach to plumbing, which I have come to understand is also his approach to people, which he gave me before he died, and which I carry into every house I enter. I am a single father. My daughter Simone is 20 years old, first year at Lewis and Clark College, studying psychology. which I say without any particular surprise, because Simone has been the most perceptive reader of rooms I have ever met, and the study of why people do what they do is the most natural extension of what she has already been doing for 20 years. Her mother and I separated when Simone was 5. The separation was civil and mutual, and we have both been committed since to making sure Simone experienced it as a change in the family's shape rather than a fracture in it, which required sustained effort and sustained goodwill from two adults who did not always feel either of those things. I want to tell you about one specific moment with Simone that I think about whenever I am in a house with an angry child, because it is the moment that turned my understanding of my own childhood into something I could use. Simone was 7. She was having an anger episode in the kitchen, the kind that looked from the outside like a tantrum and was from the inside, I knew from my own experience, something larger and less controllable. I watched her for a moment from the doorway. I recognized it, not abstractly, in my body. I had to leave the room and sit in the hallway for about 2 minutes with what I was feeling, which was the recognition of my own 7-year-old self in the kitchen in Gary, Indiana, and the specific grief of seeing my child in the same place I had been. Then I went back in. I sat on the floor. I said, "I know that feeling." She stopped yelling. She looked at me with the suspicion of a child who has been told a lot of things by adults that were not true, and said, "You do not." I said, "I had it when I was exactly your age." And I described it to her, what it felt like from the inside, the pressure without a name, the overflow without a source. She listened. Then she sat down on the floor across from me, and we sat there for 20 minutes, and the anger was not fixed, because you cannot fix the anger from the outside, but the underneath had been touched, and that was the beginning of everything. That evening was the moment I understood that the most useful thing I had was not what I knew how to do with pipes. It was what I knew about what is underneath the anger. I have been trying to use it responsibly ever since. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires you to have made your peace with your own difficulty, which takes time. And which in my case took until I was about 32 and Simone was 7, and I watched her have an anger episode that reminded me so precisely of my own at that age that I had to leave the room for a moment and sit with what I was feeling before I could respond to what she was feeling. What I was feeling was recognition, the kind of recognition that reorganizes everything, that makes you understand your past and your child's present as the same thing seen from different angles. I went back into the room. I sat on the floor. I said, "I know that feeling, not to solve it, just to name it." She looked at me. She said, "You do not." I said, "I had the same one when I was your age." She said, "What did it feel like?" I told her. She stopped yelling. We sat on the floor for 20 minutes. It was the most useful thing I have ever done as a father. It was also the thing that taught me what I know about anger, which is that it almost always has something underneath it that is not anger, and that the something underneath is almost always safer to speak than the anger is. If only someone would stay in the room long enough to ask. I want to tell you something about what 12 years of plumbing has taught me about houses before I tell you about the house on Westover Road, because the teaching is the context and the context matters. A house is a system. Every system has pressure points, which are the places where the force that runs through the system exceeds what the material at that point was designed to handle. In a plumbing system, these are the joints, the fittings, the valves, the places where one piece connects to another, and the connection is only as strong as its weakest component. When a system is under stress, the pressure points are where the failure shows. You do not fix a pressure point by patching it from the outside. You fix it by understanding what is creating the pressure and addressing that. This is the whole of plumbing, and it is also, I have come to understand over 44 years of being a person rather than a pipe, the whole of what anger is in a child. A child under stress shows the failure at the pressure points, which are the places in their behavior, where the accumulated pressure of what they are carrying exceeds what they know how to contain. You do not fix the anger by managing the behavior at the pressure point. You fix it by understanding what is creating the pressure. This understanding did not come to me from a book or a training or a therapist. It came from being the angry child and eventually, many years later, understanding what I had been carrying. The house on Westover Road is a 7,000 square foot craftsman on the west side of Portland that belongs to a woman named Diana Pratt. She is 43 years old. She is the founder and chief executive of a venture capital firm that has funded several companies I have heard of and which manages, by what circulates in the general information available about such things, a fund of substantial size. She is also, as I came to understand over the course of 3 service calls to the house, the mother of a 9-year-old boy named Ely, who is the angriest child I have met in 44 years of encountering children, including myself at my angriest. I want to be precise about this, because precision is how I respect the situation. Eli is not difficult in the way that children are sometimes called difficult when adults mean inconvenient. He is in genuine distress that expresses itself as anger, because anger is the most available language for distress when other languages have not yet been found. I know this because I was him. I know it in my hands and my chest, and the specific quality of attention I brought to the first service call at the Westover Road house, when I heard him from the kitchen while I was in the utility room and knew, without needing more information, that what I was hearing was grief wearing an anger costume. I want to tell you about the first call in detail, because the detail matters, and because what happened in those 40 minutes under the utility sink is the whole method, and I want to describe it accurately. The first call was for a burst pipe in the utility room. Standard winter damage, deferred maintenance, the kind of thing that is preventable and becomes urgent. I came on a Tuesday in February. Diana let me in at the front door, which opened into a large entryway with the particular quality of a house that has been well maintained financially and is currently under a different kind of stress. The kind that shows in the quality of the air rather than the condition of the surfaces. Everything was clean. Everything was in order. The house was performing its own competence the way some houses do when the people inside them are not able to perform theirs. Diana gave me brief instructions and went back to her office, and I went to the utility room. I could hear Yi before I reached the utility room. He was in the kitchen, which was adjacent, and what I could hear was the specific acoustic signature of a child who is looking for something large enough to absorb what they are feeling, which I recognize the way you recognize a sound you have made yourself. The first call was for a burst pipe in the utility room. Standard winter damage, deferred maintenance, the kind of thing that is preventable and becomes urgent. I came on a Tuesday in February. Diana let me in, gave me brief instructions, and went back to her office, which is what busy people do when a service professional arrives, and they trust the professional to handle it. I was in the utility room for about 40 minutes. Ely was in the kitchen, which was adjacent, separated by a door that was open about 6 inches. I could hear him and he could, if he chose to hear me. He was not speaking to anyone. He was in the kitchen with what sounded like the specific quality of destructive energy that a child produces when they are looking for something to do that is large enough to match what they are feeling. Not breaking things. Pushing chairs. Opening and closing the refrigerator with more force than the refrigerator warranted. I said nothing. I worked. About 20 minutes into the job, I heard him go quiet, which is the thing that happens with angry children when they run out of things to displace the feeling onto, and the feeling itself is temporarily in the foreground without a vehicle. A few minutes after the quiet started, I heard the door open another inch or two. I did not look. I kept working. I said, into the space under the sink rather than toward the door. The copper fitting on the left side is the one that gave way. Good fittings, just old. I was not talking to him. I was talking about the pipe. But I was talking in a way that left room for someone to receive it if they wanted to. He said nothing. I said, I have seen this fitting fail in a lot of houses this age. Usually the cold side goes first. He came a few steps into the utility room. I still did not look. I kept my eyes on the pipe. I said, do you want to hand me the wrench on the left side of the bag? I heard him pick it up. He came close enough to hand it to me. I took it without looking at him. I said, "Thank you." He said nothing. He stayed. I worked. He watched. We were in the utility room together for another 20 minutes, and he did not speak, and I did not require him to, and when I was finished, I thanked him for the wrench again, and he said, "You're welcome," in the voice of someone who has not said "you're welcome" to anything in a while and is discovering that the words still fit. I want to tell you about what I noticed between the first call and the second call, which is something I noticed not from being in the house, but from Diana's communication when she scheduled the second call. She said, "I wanted to let you know that Ely has been asking about the pipes, not in the way children sometimes express a passing interest in something an adult did." She said he had asked 3 times in the 3 weeks between the calls about how the repair worked and whether it had held. This is information. A child who asks about a pipe repair 3 times in 3 weeks is not asking about the pipe. He is asking about the person who fixed it. He is maintaining a connection to an experience that felt different from the other experiences he was having, and the pipe is the handle he has found to maintain the connection without having to say directly that he wants to come back to it. I recognize this. I had done the same thing as a child, had held on to small details of experiences that felt safer than the ones I was having at home, had kept them available in my mind the way you keep a warm room available when you know you are going to need to return to it. I came to the second call knowing more than I had known at the first one. I came knowing that the work I was doing in the house was not only about the pipes. The second call was 3 weeks later, a slow drain in the second-floor bathroom. I arrived at the same time, let myself in with the code Diana had given me, and went upstairs. Ely was in the hallway when I came up. He was not blocking the hall. He was just there, in the way children are just there when they are watching without wanting to be seen watching. I said, "Good morning." He said, "Morning." I went into the bathroom. He followed, at a distance, and stood in the doorway. I started on the drain. After a few minutes he said, "Is it the same problem as the sink?" I said, "No, different problem." He's "What kind?" I told him. He came a few steps into the bathroom. He asked another question. I answered. He asked another. The questions were good questions, the kind that come from actual curiosity rather than conversational obligation, and I answered each one as if it were the most reasonable question I had been asked all day. Which is what I try to do with questions from anyone, because the only way to keep getting questions is to honor the ones you receive. He ended up sitting on the edge of the tub for the entire job. When I was finished, he said, "What's the next part that's going to break?" I said, "Probably the valve behind the toilet. It's original to the house," he said. "When?" I said, "Hard to say. Could be a year, could be 10. He said, "Do you always know what's going to break before it breaks?" I said, "After a while you learn to look for the signs." He said, "What kind of signs?" I said, "Usually it's something that's been under pressure for a long time and hasn't been tended to. Things that don't get tended to have a way of eventually making themselves known." He was quiet. I packed up my tools. He said, "My dad didn't get tended to." The sentence arrived the way those sentences arrive, without preamble, without apparent connection to what had been said before, and with the specific weight of something that has been carried for a long time and has just found the exact right gap in a conversation to fall through. I did not respond immediately. I finished packing. I said, "That's a hard thing." He said. I said, "How long ago?" He said, 2 years. I said, "That's not very long." He nodded. I said, 2 years is about how long it took me to stop being angry after my dad died." He looked at me. He said, "You were angry." I said, "I threw things." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. I said, "I didn't understand what I was angry about for a long time." He said, "What were you angry about?" I said I missed him and I didn't have words for that yet, and the anger came out instead. He was quiet for a long time. I said, "I should get going." He said, "Okay." I got up. I went to the door. He said, "Webb." I stopped. I said, "Yes." He said, "The valve behind the toilet. Will you fix it when it breaks?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." I went downstairs. I thanked Diana and scheduled the follow-up. I drove home. I called Simone. I told her about the valve sentence and the way he had said Webb at the door. She was quiet in the way she gets quiet when something is landing in her. Then she said, "Dad." I said, "Yes." She said, "He was asking you to come back." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you going to?" I said, "The valve is going to need replacing eventually." She said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "Yes, I'm going to." I want to tell you about the sandwich before I tell you about Diana's call. Because the sandwich is the most important thing that happened on the Saturday, and I want to give it the attention it deserves. When we came out of the crawl space, Ely went to the kitchen. I assumed he was going to his room or to whatever the afternoon held for him. I started putting my tools back in the bag. A few minutes later, he came back into the hallway where I was packing up, and he was carrying 2 sandwiches on a plate, one of which he put on the floor beside my tool bag without saying anything. I looked at it. I looked at him. He had already taken his sandwich and sat down against the wall across from me, and was eating it in the particular way children eat when they are doing something they have decided to do, without wanting to make a ceremony of it. I picked up the sandwich. I sat down against the other wall. We ate our sandwiches across from each other in the hallway of the house on Westover Road, and nobody said anything, and it was, without any question, one of the finest meals I have had in 44 years. A child making you a sandwich is not a small gesture. It is the specific gesture of someone who has decided you are worth feeding, which is a category of trust that goes considerably deeper than words, and which a child like Ely does not extend without having weighed it carefully. He had weighed it. He had made the sandwiches. I received the sandwich the way it deserved to be received, which is to say quietly and completely, and without making anything of it beyond what it was, which was everything. Diana called me the following week. She said she needed to talk to me about something that was not the plumbing. I said, of course. She said she had been trying to reach Ely for 2 years, not trying to fix him, though she had tried that too. Just reach him, find the place where the real Ely was still available, underneath the anger, and make contact with it. She said every therapist she had found had been unable to get past the anger to whatever was underneath it. She said she had watched from the doorway on the second call, just the last few minutes, and she had seen him sitting on the edge of the tub asking questions, and listening to the answers, and almost smiling. And she wanted to know what had happened in that bathroom that had not happened in 2 years of professional intervention. I told her. I told her about my father and the 7 years and the school counselor, and the question that reorganized everything. I told her that anger in a child who has lost something is not a character problem. It is a communication problem. The child is saying something that has no words yet, and the anger is the closest available sound. What the anger needs is not to be managed or reduced or redirected, but to be sat with long enough for the thing underneath it to find its words. You cannot hurry that process. You can only stay in the room while it happens. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He talked to you about his father." I said, "Yes." She said, "He hasn't talked to anyone about his father in 2 years." I said, "I know." She said, "What did you say?" I told her. She was quiet again. She said, "Will you come back?" I said, "The valve behind the toilet is going to need replacing eventually." She almost laughed. She said, "I mean before that." I said, "I know." I said, "Yes. I want to tell you what Diana said to me when I left after the second call. Because what she said is the context for the Saturday, and I want to give it accurately. She walked me to the door and she said, "I have not seen him ask questions in 2 years. Not like that. Not with that kind of attention." I said, "What kind of questions has he been asking?" She said, "He barely asks questions." She said, "He responds to things with anger or with silence, and the silence is worse in some ways, because at least the anger is alive." I said, "The questions about the pipe last week?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Those questions were not about the pipe." She looked at me. I said he was asking about something that felt safe enough to ask about. The pipe is just the subject. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What do I do with that?" I said, "You wait for more questions." She said, "That's all." I said, "That's the beginning." She said, "I have been waiting for 2 years." I said, "You have been waiting for the anger to stop. That's different from waiting for the questions to start." She was quiet. I said, "The questions are the questions under the anger." They're what the anger has been covering. She said, what do I do when they come? I said, you answer them. Just the way I answered the ones about the pipe. As if they are the most reasonable questions anyone has asked you today. She said, what if the questions are hard? I said, especially then. She nodded. I left. I thought about my own questions at 9 years old, the ones that had no place to go, because the grief that was producing them had no language yet. And I thought about what it would have meant to had someone who would have answered them the way I had answered Elise, without flinching and without making them into a problem. I came back on a Saturday, not for plumbing. Diana had asked if I would be willing to spend an hour with Ely, not as a therapist, not as anything formal, just as a person who had some things to check in the crawl space that might as well be done while I was there. Ely was in the kitchen when I arrived. I said morning. He said morning. I said I need to check the main shoot-off in the crawl space and asked if he wanted to see it. He said okay. We spent an hour in the crawl space looking at pipes. He asked 40 questions. I answered all of them. At some point he said, do you think the pipes know when something's wrong with them? I said, I think they just do what water does, which is find the path of least resistance. He thought about that. He said, that's what I do. I said, most people do. He said, my therapist says as I need to find better paths. I said, maybe. Or maybe you just need to figure out where all that water is trying to go. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I think it's trying to go to my dad. I said, yeah, I think you're right. We were in the crawl space for another 20 minutes after that, not talking, just being in the same space with the same pipes. And when we came out, he went to the kitchen and he made 2 sandwiches, one for him and one for me, without being asked. Which is a thing a child does when they have decided you are worth feeding, which is as clear a signal of trust as I know how to read. Diana offered to pay me for the Saturday. I told her no. She said there had to be something. I told her what I always tell people at this point in a conversation, which is that what had happened between me and Ely was not a service. It was just 2 people who had the same thing happen to them when they were young, sitting in a crawl space looking at pipes. She could not pay for that. What she could do, if she wanted to do something, was let Ely know that the anger was not the enemy. That the anger was trying to say something that did not have words yet, and that the something was allowed to be there while the words were being found. She said, how do I do that? I said, the next time he gets angry, instead of trying to stop it, ask him what it's about underneath. He will probably say nothing or I don't know. That's fine. You just keep asking, not insistently, just gently over days and weeks and months, and eventually the underneath gets named. She said, what if it takes a long time? I said, 2 years is not very long. She said, it feels long. I said, I know. I know it does. I went home. Simone called me that evening. She said, how did it go? I said, we ate sandwiches. She said, he made you a sandwich. I said, yes. She said, Dad, that's everything. I said, I know, it kind of is. I want to leave you with the image I carry from this story, because it is the image I think says everything without needing anything added to it. A 9-year-old boy in the crawl space of a house in Portland, Oregon, sitting next to a plumber he met 3 weeks ago, surrounded by pipes that have been under pressure for years and are finally being tended to saying, I think it's trying to go to my dad. That sentence, in the crawl space, with the pipes, it is the most complete description of grief I have encountered in 44 years of being a person, and it came from a 9-year-old who had not said anything about his father in 2 years. And it came because a man who had once been him was patient enough to stay under the sink and talk about pipes until the thing underneath the pipes found its way up. I did not fix Eli's grief. Nobody can fix grief, but I was there when it found its words. That is the only thing that was ever needed. That is the only thing I was ever able to give. It was, as it turns out, enough. I drove home past the pipes I had fixed on Westover Road, and I thought about my father. And I thought about 7 years of anger that was grief wearing a costume. And I thought about the school counselor who had asked the right question. And I thought about Ely in the crawl space saying, I think it's trying to go to my dad. And I thought about how long it takes for a thing under pressure to find the path that lets it move, and how the path is always there. and how the only thing you can do is stay close enough to see it when it opens. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. Is there an angry person in your life who you have been trying to stop rather than hear? Not asking you to accept the anger or to be harmed by it. Just asking if you have ever asked the question underneath it, the one that is not about the behavior but about the source, the one that says, what is this actually about? Because I think if you asked it, you might find out that the anger has been trying to tell you something important for a very long time and has been waiting for someone patient enough to listen for it. Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the anger you have been trying to stop. Tell me what you think might be underneath it. I read every single one and I would be honored to know. Hit subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like so this reaches the parent who needs it tonight. And I will see you in the next one.